Okay, we are on. Hello, this is Andy83 and welcome to another episode of TankeKrim. As you may notice, we speak English now, and the reason for that is that we have a special guest all the way from Canada. I'll introduce him last. First, I'll introduce the usual bunch, and that is Inge. Hello, Inge.
Hello.
And Onar. Hello,
Hello.
Onar. Yes. And the last one today is all the way from Canada. He calls himself Vlad, and he's a counter-jihadist blogger. Hello.
Hi, thanks for inviting me on your program.
You're welcome. So, counter-jihad, to be honest with you, I'm not really familiar with that term. I've heard it online, but could you please explain to me what a counter-jihad means?
Well, essentially, there was some discussion many years ago between a group of us that worked together online, trying to, I guess the common expression now is red pill the rest of the population as to the nature of Islam and the fact that Islam is a threat doctrine to classical civilization. So we were trying to find a name for this movement which simply expressed what it is that we were and what we were trying to do. So we came up with the concept of counter jihad. It's a hyphenated word, so it's counter-jihad. It was actually coined by a fellow who calls himself Baron Boddassé over at the Gates of Vienna.net, which is an exceptionally good blog on the subject of Islam, its nature and intention.
Is that a Norwegian site? Sorry to interrupt you, but is that a Norwegian site? Is that Fjordman who has that one?
No, the fellow's name is, I think, well, he goes by Baron Boddassé. I believe he's public now, but I prefer that people, if they want to mention their real name on these circles, that they do it themselves. But yes, Fjordman is very connected to that site and is an outstanding contributor. And in fact, Fjordman's a big part of the reason that I myself got into the movement, because his analysis and early essays on the subject were second to none. They were an order of magnitude better than anything else written on the subject for that time.
I see. Okay. Onar or Inge, do you have any familiarity with the term counter-jihad? Have you heard of it?
I have not heard of it. This is like the first time I hear the term. I'm sort of familiar. I can guess from the term what it means. I'm not familiar with any of Fjordman's work or with the Gates of Vienna. I've heard of it in the news in connection to Anders Breivik, the killer in Norway who allegedly read and was inspired by Fjordman. So in Norway, Fjordman is sort of like a toxic topic.
Yeah.
But as far as I could tell from the very little I've read from him, he's just making an analysis of Islam, which is very cogent. But my impression has always been that focusing on Islam is really going down the wrong path. Like a couple of months ago, I wrote an article which was spread. Pamela Geller, who has the blog Atlas Shrugs, shared one of my articles called "The Greatest Threat to America is Not Islam, It's the Left." And in this, I basically say that Islam is weak. Islam has never been a strong civilization. Muslims are mostly illiterate. They can't read and write. 50% can't read and write, and they can't do anything without Western aid. So they have no technology, they have no science, they have no literature. They're basically just living in the Dark Ages. So for a strong civilization, Islam is not a threat. The real threat is the left, which is like AIDS, mental AIDS, or civilizational HIV. What's your view on that?
I would very much like to speak to that. First of all, I agree 100% with your premise. All right, that is to say that the greater issue and the greater problem is the effect that leftism has had on our civilization, and we should go into detail about exactly how they do that. The analogy, by the way, of comparing of comparing the left to HIV and Islam to the cold that kills the patient, it was first used, to the best of my knowledge, was first used at a memorial service to a Dutch politician, Pim Fortuyn, that was murdered by, actually, I think he was murdered by a leftist, but a leftist who was sympathetic to Islam. And so it was in the name of Islam that he was killed in any case. So for those who are interested, and I strongly recommend it, if you go to my website, which is vladtepesblog.com, and you click on the page called the agenda and views of this site and scroll down a bit, there's a download link to an English transcript of the speech originally given in Dutch at the memorial service. This is way over 10 years ago for Pim Fortuyn. Now, again, the analogy is excellent. So it's your conclusion that I have some small issues with. And if you were to continue your medical analogy, do you know are you familiar with the English term triage? I guess it's probably a French term. Triage refers to when you go into a medical facility, the first professional that you meet is somebody who assesses what your problem is and then determines how quickly or how urgently you need to be treated. And that's called triage, right? It's the first stage of any emergency center. Now, if a person with a flu and AIDS goes into a emergency center, triage will determine that what needs to be treated is the flu, not AIDS, because the AIDS is a chronic problem, and the flu is an acute problem. So chronic means, of course, long-term, serious but long-term, and acute means that it's an immediate threat to your life. Now, Islam is the acute problem, and leftism is the chronic problem. So while I completely not only do I accept and like your medical analogy and endorse it, I've been using it myself for about a decade. But again, I think your triage is incorrect. While it's absolutely true that the AIDS needs to be understood and treated as the underlying problem, it is Islam which is in immediate threat of destroying our civilization, and that has to be addressed really quickly and really severely.
Can you explain why you think that this is an acute problem with Islam? Why is it an immediate threat?
Well, I mean, we could talk about the obvious stuff, which is the constant and daily terrorism that we see everywhere. But I actually, in truth, I'm not really sure. I mean, I'm not really sure that the terrorism is the big problem. The big problem is the rapid changes in all of our institutions, and even worse, the underlying philosophical foundations of our institution to accommodate Islamic foundational thought, which is fundamentally different. In fact, let's look at it this way. We could almost look at as I'm going to use a triangle. At one point of the triangle, there is classical thought. Classical thought stems from the Greeks, most specifically Aristotle, Socrates, what have you, right? And they came up with a system of thought. Let's call it a cognitive tool, logic. And Western European civilization off and on, and let's say the Byzantines from the Greeks and going west and into North America used this system. And it's what allowed us to become the healthiest, wealthiest, longest lived, most peaceful, and it allowed us to become a civilization that put man on the moon so many times it became boring. The accomplishments of classical civilization through the cognitive tools of logic and reason have led to a list of accomplishments which would have been seen as nothing short of very, very beyond the scope of people who believed in magic that was even possible, right? Even, I mean, the smartphone alone, we could go on and on. So sure. The type of thinking that we have, and now I'm passing value judgment on it because it's important that we do, I think, as well as talk about the difference. So on another point of the triangle, we've got leftist thought. Leftist thought is more accurately described as postmodern thought. For those who are interested in an in-depth understanding of postmodernism, I can recommend two books, and I think with a good understanding of the contents of these two books, you'll probably know more than the vast majority of the public. And one of them is Explaining Postmodernism by a philosophy professor named Stephen Hicks.
Oh, I'm familiar with that.
Yes, and Jordan Peterson, of course, calls that book compulsory reading, and he's absolutely right. I think if you read that book, you'll even find where Jordan Peterson occasionally makes an occasional misspeak, because that book is so good. It's so foundational for understanding postmodernism. It's not a real fun read at first, but as you get into it, it gets clear. I personally I think I'm on my third go through, but it's really worth it. And the second book, which is more direct in terms of its practical discussions of how postmodernist thought has impacted contemporary Western science, is a book called The Blank Slate by Harvard PhD psychologist named Steven Pinker.
I know him, yes.
Yeah, familiar with that guy, yeah.
So his book, The Blank Slate, brilliantly details how postmodern thought has infected and destroyed, in some ways, contemporary scientific thought. Because now where I was really, let me just get back to my premise. On the second corner of this triangle, you have postmodernist thought, which is fundamentally different than classical thought. It doesn't just not use logic, it actually hates logic. So logic, we could say in one sentence, we could say that logic is reason-based conclusions. That is to say that the Western person will look at data, they'll look around them, they'll come up with an argument, they'll draw a conclusion from the available evidence, and then they'll test that conclusion trying to falsify it, developing better and better models of reality, right?
Yes.
And then we have postmodernist thought, which is conclusion-based reasoning. And that is to say, they start out with a bunch of things that they think must be true, whether they are true or not, but they feel need to be true, and they only accept any reasoning which leads to those conclusions, and any reasoning that does not, they punish, usually by killing or gulags or re-education camps. We can call this process, for lack of a better term, although there are better terms, but for the moment, I think we'll call it political correctness, because as we see political correctness evolve from a form of kind of mild politeness into a form of the application of the force of law into incorrect thinking, we see exactly how this works. If you say something which is true, but does not lead you to the conclusion which leftism or postmodernist thought wants from you, then they apply the force of the law, or they cost you your job, or they ostracize you, whatever. We're seeing it from Germany, England, Scandinavia. It's frightening to think about. And Canada, of course, is pondering a bill called M103. M103 is a motion which is being discussed right now to become legislation which will use, and I quote, a whole of government response, unquote, to, quote, quell, unquote, any Islamophobic, and it specifies Islamophobia. So what we're seeing here is that the application of postmodern thought across the Western world, which is to defend specifically Islam, which is the third corner of this triangle. So to wrap up the second corner of the triangle, we have postmodern thought, which we saw brilliantly exemplified in China and in the Soviet Union, where if you could make up any nonsense you wanted that led to a postmodern or communist conclusion, but if you used actual reasoning in science, they would punish you severely if it did not. Now, the third corner of the triangle is Islam. Now, this is not an equal sides triangle. The Islam side is much closer to the postmodern side, and this is answering a question that you haven't asked yet, but most people do ask. You guys, I suspect, already know, but most people ask, why would leftism be so allied with Islam when Islam seems to be against all of the things that leftists claim to be for? And the answer is, the claims of leftism have nothing to do with the goals of leftism. Those are tactics. In fact, leftism is also a conclusion-based reasoning where they believe in divine law as determined by their deity Allah and brought about by his meat puppet Mohammed. And Mohammed made a bunch of claims like leftism does, and anybody that doesn't support those claims in every possible way is guilty of heresy, in essence, right, of blasphemy or what have you. And it's almost identical. To be honest with you, Islam and postmodernist thought are at a certain very important level of abstraction identical, right? It's only in some of the minor manifestations of how these play out where there's a difference. And so that's why.
I completely agree with that assessment, by the way.
Inge, you got any thoughts on this?
Well, I guess I'm kind of a middle of the expressed main ideas. I'm thinking about, for example, Bill Warner have shown Islamic attacks through the centuries.
Whenever you're dealing with an apologist for Islam or even a Muslim and you bring up jihad, almost immediately they kick back to you, well, what about those terrible crusades? Why, they're the moral justification for jihad. I mean, we're just as bad as they are, so let's not talk about jihad, okay? Let's talk about the crusades. Well, what I would like to talk about here are facts. And it turns out I sat down and put together some work and I created a database of some 548 battles that Islam fought, jihad battles against classical civilization. And this aren't even all the battles. It really doesn't say much about Africa and India, Afghanistan and all that. It's primarily the battles against the classical civilization of Rome and Greece. So, 548 battles is a lot, and it's too much to even comprehend. So I created something which I call a dynamic battle map, in which you have a display of the Mediterranean, and a white dot means that this 20-year period, that's a new battle. So every time the screen changes, it's 20-year period. The colors white turn to red, and so you can see a history. This may seem a little confusing, but I think when you see it, you'll know exactly what I mean. And here it starts. Islam burst out of the Arabian Peninsula and immediately starts attacking the Middle East. And notice that it doesn't take long until they're crossing the Mediterranean and attacking southern France and Spain. Notice something here. Most people think of Islam, they think of Arabs, they think of desert, and yet here we see that Islam is projecting power throughout the Mediterranean. Notice how the little islands of the Mediterranean are getting hammered. The navy of Islam would attack coastal towns, kill, rob, rape, and then take slaves. So this whole battle map, as it unfolds, you're seeing slaves being taken. Over 1 million slaves were taken out of Europe into the Islamic world. That's something you don't think about much, but it's absolutely true. There were over 200 battles fought in Spain alone. And we also see, however, on the east coast in Turkey, that Islam is trying to break into Europe. Now, what's going to happen is, in Spain, this ongoing fight that lasted for 400 years, the Christians are going to push back the Muslims. But now then what has happened over in the east is that Constantinople has fallen, and now then Eastern Europe is getting hammered. The jihad now comes to Eastern Europe. It's pushed out now of Spain. Northern Africa is now completely Islamic. The Middle East is completely Islamic. This is all jihad, relentless jihad. And why is it so relentless? Well, Muhammad was relentless in his jihad. And these people are good students of Islam, and so it's against the kafir, on and on. It was traditional that when the Sultan came to power, the brand new Sultan, he would immediately try to launch new wars because he was going to be noted in his Islamic history as to how well he fought against the kafir. So that's what the jihad looked like.
The Islamic leaders have been very successful in imperialism since beginning, managed to colonize whole of North Africa, as far east to Indonesia, taking over Spain, Portugal for almost 800 years, and before Western socialism. So I think absolutely there are potent in from Islam itself and the Islamic leaderships.
My comment to that would be that Islam was able to do that only after the Roman Empire had collapsed and weakened itself through hundreds of years of a welfare state and corruption and imperialism and a war with Persia and natural disasters.
Actually, I'd kind of like to just support that that gentleman's statement. I'm sorry, I've lost track of who we're talking to, and I'm bad with names anyway. But the fact is, though, that there are many post-leftist nations and civilizations where the Soviet Union collapsed. Venezuela will soon. The only places that haven't collapsed, I think, are Cuba and North Korea, and they're propped up basically by the corruption of other states around them. Otherwise, because their systems are unsustainable. But there are only two post-Islamic nations: is Israel and Spain. And everywhere else that's ever been conquered by Islam, actually, that's not really quite true, is it? Because I'd say big parts of Eastern Europe at one point were kind of behind the Iron Curtain of Islam, if you like. They may not have been totally ruled by the Ottomans, but essentially they were kind of like Romania. The Ottomans kind of controlled those nations without completely conquering them. But generally speaking, the evidence is pretty good that once conquered by Islam, it's a lot more difficult to come back.
Now, I want to comment on one thing, on the similarity between postmodernism or progressivism, if you like, and Islam. They do have one very, very important thing in common, that this is how actually postmodernism or progressivism has been acting like an HIV over the course. They have the same tactic, which is to destroy a culture's past. If you can destroy a civilization's history, a sense of identity, a sense of past, then you control their future. This is why you see why ISIS and Al Qaeda and all of these, they have always destroyed these buildings by great civilizations, raising signs of the past.
Everything you touch, you don't feel, do not know what you steal.
And this is in order for them to be able to implement new ideology from scratch. And in that sense, they are progressive. Because what is the key element of progressivism? It's that they hate the past. They are sort of hyper modernistic. Everything that's old is old-fashioned and has to go. Then progressives hate the past, and they try to destroy everything in the past because it doesn't represent their ideals. So what they do is they go into the universities and they rewrite history. And what they do in the universities what ISIS does very crudely with explosives on buildings. Rather than destroying Buddha statues in Afghanistan or Palmyra in Syria, these great ancient sites, what the left does is that they destroy anything that's great about Western history and civilization, and then they insert instead a narrative about how awful the West is. So they whitewash everything from other cultures. So now all of a sudden, Islam is the greatest civilization that ever existed, and it's a religion of peace, whereas the West practically invented slavery, according to the left.
Yes, and I also noticed that, if I may intercept a little bit, when it comes to understanding history, we have the Crusades, you know?
But remember, When you bring up jihad, people want to bring up the Crusades. So I also prepared a dynamic battle map of all the offensive raids of the Crusaders. Let's watch it and make a comparison. And so it begins. The Crusades enter into Turkey and the Middle East. Battles go on, but aren't there far fewer than you thought there might be? And here we go. The last battles are fought, and that is the end of the Crusades. So now then we can talk about some facts. Yes, there were Crusades, but notice they ended centuries ago, and jihad is being practiced today. Jihad has been with us for 1,400 years. There is no comparison between jihad and the Crusades, certainly not a moral comparison. And when you're looking at the Crusades, remember, in one sense, all of the Crusades were defensive wars. Why? Well, as we saw in the first jihad map, it was Islam that came out of Arabia and conquered the Middle East, a Christian Middle East. And so the Crusaders were trying to free their Christian brothers and sisters from jihad. So there's no moral comparison at all. The motivation of the Crusaders was to free Christians. The purpose of jihad is to enslave the kafir. So the next time you hear somebody talk about, oh, those dreadful Crusades, you've seen some facts about the matter. Why don't you pipe up and tell them you know, you don't really know the matter?
Constantly, when I think back to my school years and how I was educated in history, I was taught that Crusades were something Christians did to be dominant, imperialistic, evil, and I don't even think that it was expressed clearly that it was a war against Islam. Islam was never mentioned. I think it was just Christians going to other places to dominate them, and then
Can I make a prediction?
Yes.
I predict that if we go 100 years from now and postmodernism still is in effect, then they will say the same thing about World War II, that the Americans were imperialists that went to Europe and just destroyed Europe.
I don't think you have to go 100 years for that. I think if any university professor in the humanities in the Western world heard what you said, they'd start saying it tomorrow.
Anything to attack United States, yes.
So the Crusades are, I mean, essentially the same as World War II. It was a defense war, and to present the Crusades in the way they do is like presenting America and the Allies as the bad guys.
Yes.
In World War II.
And also talk a little bit about the Ottoman Empire. Again, thinking back to when I had history in school, the Ottoman Empire was, I don't ever think was explicitly stated was Islamic. It was like you had the Ottoman Empire, and they conquered these places in Europe and the world. But it was never expressed explicitly that this is a Muslim empire. This is a, I think the word caliphate, is that correct to use? It was a caliphate?
Yeah, may I just take a moment to say something about that, actually?
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, and there's two reasons for it, I think. That are, one's a completely legitimate one, and one I think is tactical. The first reason is that Europe back in the time that the Islamic world was attacking them didn't have phones, and they didn't have any kind of communication that was faster than horseback, right? So you saw one part of Europe was being attacked by the Ottomans, another part by the Moors, another part by the Barbary pirates. And so all of these different parts of Europe and even North America didn't recognize that these were all different phases of the same problem, which was Islamic jihad for global manifest destiny. So you ended up with these different names because even though each area, I think, understood the problem, they had different names for it because they were seeing a different people and a different tactic. So then, of course, now in modern times, they want to make sure that Islam is somehow extricated from these events so that Islam doesn't look bad. Because, as I'm sure you're all acutely aware, the definition of slander in Islamic Sharia law is anything that makes Islam look bad to non-Muslims, even if it's true. And this is an important thing. This is codified. This is not my sort of cynical view of it. even though if it was, it would be fully accurate in terms of the way we see things play out. But it's actually codified in Reliance of the Traveler, which is the most authoritative book on Sharia law ever written. So, and by every Muslim authority that matters. Okay, so you clearly see that now, in order to accommodate the Islamic version of slander, which you can also somewhat read in the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam as presented by the OIC to the UN, you'll also see this. So now moving backwards a little bit though, the other day I guess I didn't say really what I do much and what exactly it is I do. So here's a chance for me to say a little bit of it. I work with an incredible team of really wonderful people who translate as volunteers from multiple languages, news videos and other videos that show, like people's personal videos that show the events of Islam and leftism across the Western world. And I'm the point guy. Basically, they send me the translations. Technically, they go to Gates of Vienna. He edits them to make sure that the English is good and that the concepts are clearly understandable. And then they send it to me where I do the hard coding. So for those of you that are interested, you've probably seen videos that our team has done. At the end, there's usually a little tag which says clips for the counter jihad, right? And so recently, a couple of days ago, we did, and I'll give you a link to it. You can edit it right into this if you want. You can edit it right into this video.
We'll do so.
We did a video of some gentleman in Romania, which of course, in my namesake is a Romanian hero, Vlad Tepes, who defended his nation against the most brutal Ottoman assault, an attempt to enslave his people and take the children as janissaries and rape the women. All the stuff you see today, frankly, and you've seen for 1,400 years. And unfortunately, a British novelist made him into a monster. And that British novelist should have had a couple of history lessons before he wrote that book. The book, of course, is Dracula. But in fact, Vlad Tepes was a real hero who defended his nation for many years against the most vile form of oppression from Islamic overlords. Now,
I wouldn't be surprised if he was a leftist, the guy who wrote Dracula.
Bram Stoker.
I wouldn't be surprised one bit. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a postmodern attempt to change history, to make the good guys look like the bad guys. Really, I totally agree with you, because the more I look into some of these authors and philosophers from Europe, going back a couple of centuries, the more I realize that what they wrote was deliberate. I blame Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein for a lot of our problems, because frankly, if there's a monster and a mad scientist in a castle, the people who show up with the pitchforks and the torches, they're the good guy, right? Mary Shelley turned that on its head. So, and I think that kind of mentality is a big part of our problem today. But anyway, I've now actually taken
a little insert there is that I think the book is different from the Hollywood reinterpretation of Frankenstein. I think it's very much clearer that Frankenstein is. I don't even think there is like a pitchfork thing there. I think mainly when we think of Frankenstein in that way, it's the Hollywood reimagining of it. I'm just saying, yeah.
But in the book, Mary Shelley makes it out that he's the victim. The monster is the victim, and the villagers are bigoted, racist guys who are afraid of anything different, right? So in fact, like I say, I'm kind of half joking, but I sort of kind of blame Mary Shelley for a lot of this, and her husband, who is also a postmodernist. But anyway,
and her mother is the first feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the first big feminists of Europe. I'm just inserting.
That's interesting. I didn't even know that. So, so anyway, we did this video where an opera was performed in a city. I don't remember the name of the city. It's one syllable. It's in Romania. And now the way I understand it, so I'm going to differentiate between what I think and what I know. What I think is that this particular opera house was given instructions by somebody in what I consider to be the Great Cabal, which is European Union, George Soros, a couple of other Muslim billionaires, Obama, Merkel, and Trudeau, was given his instructions that you were doing this great multicultural theater thing, and it would have an imam beautifully singing the Mazain call to prayer. So they staged this whole thing in Romania, and some politicians went to see it. And when he began to chant the stuff about Allah, they stood up and they started to sing the Romanian national anthem. And then, of course, got thrown out of the theater. But I subtitled that whole thing, and I did a bit of research, and it turns out, and I really think that you guys would find this fun to do. I'll give you a link to this too. Read the words to the Romanian national anthem and look it up on Wikipedia. It is absolutely, unquestionably an attempt to keep their real history alive. It is an anthem about the threat of Islamic invasion, who they call the barbarians, and what the Muslims did to their women and children. And that anthem is unbelievably hardcore. And I'm so proud of Romania for having not changed it into something insipid and pointless.
Can I interject something for the listeners? Because I just recently learned that Vlad the Impaler was called that because he actually used the tactics used by the Muslims. It was actually the Muslim jihadists that were impaling people, putting their heads on sticks. And he was just returning the favor. And it's because he was doing the same thing as the Muslims in self-defense that he's now considered a monster. That's a very postmodernist thing to do.
Yes, I might add, you're absolutely right. It's classic postmodern tactic to make two horrors equivalent and then pick the other one as the good guy since they're equivalent, right? That because it's not reasoning, it's tactical, and you're absolutely right. And so what I was going to say is if you listen to the Romanian anthem, you'll get a solid sense of their remembrance of history. But also, and this is the fun part of it for someone who's looking for something less academic to do, there is a movie called Dracula Untold, and it's new, and for some reason never seemed to really get into the big theaters, even though it's a high budget production. It's very well done. It's well acted. The effects are great. It's really well written. And the reason is, and you should watch this with the pause button in your hand, because over and over there's references to the fact that the Ottomans were acting on behalf of Islam and under Islamic, the acting out Islamic manifest destiny. They even show the Shahada a couple of times. They show that the invading Muslim armies, as they attacked Transylvania, they showed banners with the Shahada and the Islamic Declaration of Faith, and they showed it on contracts. It's really, and they talk about, in other words, it's still a monster movie, right? The Dracula Untold is still an unusually good monster movie with a particularly good monster, I might add, like perhaps the best Dracula I've seen, and really well acted, and his lines are amazing. But the point is that they make it clear that they were operating under Islamic orders, And they mention a lot of real history in the film. At one point in the movie, and this is not a spoiler, a guy walks into Vlad's court and starts demanding children, and he lists what he's going to use the children for. Said, children at this age will be trained to be soldiers, and then they will take the gates of Vienna. They'll join the siege on Vienna. And these children at this age will go for this campaign and so on. So whoever wrote this movie was trying to find a way to reignite in the popular culture genuine history and knowledge of Islam, and it didn't make the big theaters, but I'm doing my best to spread it. So
Very
really,
interesting.
yeah,
Very-
it really is good.
I know about the movie. It's supposed to be the first movie in the Universal Extended Universe or something, where The Mummy with Tom Cruise was supposed to be the sequel. But as you pointed out, the movie you're talking about, Dracula Untold, was not a commercial success. And so it's not been seen as canon. The first movie that's supposed to be about Universal's extended universe is The Mummy now. And I guess I've not seen The Mummy, but I think it's supposed to be a hell of a lot more PC than you are now painting Dracula Untold to be. I've not seen that movie, but I will definitely watch it now. Just for fun.
Well, it's really good. And I'd just like to point out, to add to your point from a minute ago, which you very well put, that Vlad Tepes was in fact using Islamic tactics by impaling the invading Muslim armies. I just want to augment that by saying that it should be understood that Vlad himself was taken by the Ottomans as tribute from his father, who was the king. Vlad Dracula's father he was taken as a janissary and raised to be in the Sultan's army, and then escaped and made it back to take over his own country to defend him against the Ottoman Empire. So, and his brother, in fact, stayed. His brother Radu stayed because he was too young to remember his real life, and he ended up, going native, as they say. So it's not just that he was using Islamic tactics; it's that he was using tactics he learned as a janissary, as a kidnapped child soldier. So it was more than just turnaround; it was justice.
That's very interesting, and it's a good story. I would say that when Romanians stand up like that, it's a little bit similar to when we have neo-Nazis in Norway who are marching in the streets, and people protest them because they have a vivid memory of being invaded by the Nazis. And it appears to me that the Romanians have the same vivid collective memory of the Islamic invasion from the Ottoman Empire.
Yes. Inge, do you have something to add to this?
Well, history revisionism seems to be a key word here. And also Vlad mentioned the Barbary states. They were at war with the United States, actually, in the 17th, 1800s. How well is that known, you think, Vlad?
So I'm a huge fan of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is one of the greatest human beings that ever lived. I think if I had to pick the top 5 or 10 humans, Jefferson would be one of them. I think he's right there with Aristotle, frankly. Jefferson understood the threat of Islam very well. When he was ambassador to France from the United States, he did all of his research and wrote a fair amount about it. He started the Marines to defeat the Barbary pirates, and the Marines' theme song was about defeating the Barbary pirates right back to Tripoli, in Libya, which is, of course, where their point of origin at that time. And his Marines were initially called the Leathernecks because their uniforms had specially thick leather turtleneck, if you like, to protect the soldiers, because, of course, Quran says that you should strike at the infidels at the neck. So the classic Islamic tactic was to take their sword and they would go for your neck. So the Marines were created with a special uniform against that tactic, and they were typically called the leathernecks for a very long time. They still are by people, sort of old school people in the know. The direct answer to your question is nobody knows, right? People in the West, they think Thomas Jefferson's a horrible guy that raped his slaves. It's really stunning. And I'd just like to add to this whole discussion about historical revisionism, that George Orwell stated the entire thing in 2 sentences. And I think the 2 sentences on their own may not ring quite as important as they will at this point in this discussion, because it takes a lot of thought. But having said everything that we've all said, when Orwell says, he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past, it suddenly makes your blood congeal in your veins, because we are seeing that. We are seeing contemporary academics control how the past is viewed by general academia and the general public in order to dramatically change the decisions they make, and so that the future will look like they want it to, which will be a wasteland. It's worth mentioning that the 2 biggest threats to the environment, global warming, of course, is a hysterical bunch of nonsense created by postmodernists in order to make Western efficient industry look bad. But if you look at the way, even Winston Churchill said in his famous book, The River Wars, I should say the book's not that famous, but his quote from The River Wars about Islam is tremendously famous. And in that 1 or 2 paragraph quote, he says, quote, "their slovenly methods of agriculture," meaning they never developed. In Islam, they never really developed proper agriculture. And of course, communists laid waste to the land wherever they went, because, again, it's conclusion-based reasoning, not reason-based conclusions. So they would invent things like that wheat had to grow in Siberia, and so they would kill tens of thousands of people trying to force wheat to grow there when it couldn't, but they believed it must because communism needed it to. I'm not making this up. This isn't me coming up with an exaggerated example to prove my point. This is what they actually did. So
but the history books will not contain that because it goes against leftism, and they don't want to say anything bad about leftism.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, exactly.
Well, I think we had an interesting conversation tonight. I just wanted to go back shortly about counter-jihad, because I get association that we're going to use jihadist tactics against Muslims. So I just wanted to know, counter-jihad, what are your strategies? What is the end goal here?
Okay, so first of all, I'm glad you asked that question. I suppose I see how a person could think that. Strategically, the counter-jihad is a loose group of like-minded allies who are strictly seeking to provide the information to the general public that the mainstream media, having been co-opted by leftist agencies, will not provide us with. So in other words, it's purely informational. We find videos that demonstrate what's actually taking place and make them more widely available, for which there's been countermeasures, by the way. And I'd like to talk about that for a minute, if I could, in a moment, right? So but to answer your question directly, the strategy is informational. We are trying to make sure that information is available to all who seek it about what is actually taking place using standard reason and the methods of Western thought for the last couple of thousand years. So the tactics are often video, it's essays. Fjordman is a counter-jihadist in that he writes essays which are predictive, which are analytical, and talk about the facts and what those facts mean and what's likely to happen as a result of these facts, which are things that various nations are trying to make illegal, Canada among them, Canada perhaps chief among them. So, and of course, the UK just passed a law saying if people look at, quote, extremist literature, unquote, that you could go to jail for 15 years, which strikes me as being something that Orwell would have just shrugged and nodded at. But in any case, so strategically, it's informational. Tactically, it is through videos, through essays, and I suppose this interview just is one example, this podcast. So now back to the countermeasures. YouTube, I'm sure most people, anybody who's kind of dialed in enough, anybody who's, as we say, red-pilled enough to listen to this podcast will also know that there are massive problems with Google, Google subsidiary YouTube, Facebook, and these other organizations, which for one reason or another, whether it's because of greed or threats or because they're true believers, are slanting things heavily toward postmodernist goals and ambitions. They haven't taken, I've had several channels taken down already. YouTube has not seen fit to do that, but I think what they're doing instead is gray listing me. And that means that the people who subscribe to my YouTube channel, although you can usually see most of my videos at my website, which is vladtepesblog.com, but those people that have subscribed to my YouTube channel don't get the notifications. And I know that because people have left comments saying that's weird. I subscribe to the channel and I hit the little bell and I'm not getting the notifications. So that's kind of gray listing. So my videos are not getting disseminated to the extent that they would if YouTube was acting as a fair agent, right? So there's something, a new old technology a guy came up with. It's a website called bitchute.com. That's bitchute.com. And what he did is took an old technology called BitTorrenting and found a way so that you can upload a video to that website. It will hash it and distribute it to different computers and systems. And your own browser, when you look at the video, will assemble it for you as a streaming video the same way YouTube does. So from a user point of view, it's just like YouTube or LiveLeak or vid.me, where I have channels also, by the way. But from a technical point of view, because it's using BitTorrenting technology rather than a single server, which can get to decide who sees what, it's much more difficult to interfere with and to get rid of. Even if they take down this guy's website, these videos will still be out there and still be disseminating through BitTorrenting. So, and I encourage people to go start bitchute.com channels or to register there and check. Every video that I do now on YouTube also is mirrored there, but any video that I feel that YouTube may object to because of community standards, which means something that graphically shows what a Muslim attack did or looks like, or anything that makes Islam look like what it is, they will give me a strike and take it down. So I won't put it up there, but I will put it at BitChute. So bitchute.com, recommend it. It's a great technology, and I'm hoping that their effort pays off and it gets past the tipping point of these new social media sites that fail so often.
We'll add you to the description, the channels and the websites you have mentioned. Perhaps we should consider uploading TankeKrim to these sites as well. Well, thank you for joining us. I hope you will. Yes, sure.
Can I have a final, a little bit comment here? Because I just wanted to get back to the point that I still don't think that Islam is the acute problem here. I think it's the postmodernists. And I'm very much in favor of Jordan Peterson's approach to this. He says the way to win the game is to not play their game. It's to play your own game. In other words, instead of doing what they want you to do and expect you to do, which is to attack Islam so that they can say, look at all the Nazis, proving their point and all of this. It is important to go directly at go for the jugular of the postmodernists. And I mean that not literally.
No.
That was not meant as a violence.
No, metaphor. It was a metaphor. We get it. Yes.
Yes. But for anyone who might.
So my response to that is that Jordan Peterson, as much as I love, admire, and respect that man, in my opinion, and I could prove it actually, in my opinion, he underestimates the degree of strategic planning that the leftists have done and the Muslims have done, and feels that a lot of what we're seeing are natural consequences of normal, not actually malicious actions that were planned well in advance. I know that he does that.
That may be true, but notice how he has succeeded. Like I talk to people now who would never want to listen to anything of what you had to say, but which listened to Jordan Peterson. And he is inoculating people from postmodernism. And if you can make people wake up to the fact that there are some crazy people out there in academia who are infecting people in academia with pure evil. Then
You're absolutely right about all that. And I guess I'm just going to take my last word. You can certainly speak to my last word on it is this. Carlos the Jackal, who is a very famous professional assassin who converted to Islam. He's a Palestinian who converted to Islam and did an awful lot of strategic killing and tactical killing in his day, who's in jail in France right now, wrote a letter to President Obama saying that the only way the West can be brought down is a combination of leftism and Islam. And that's my last word on this. So I think our argument about which thing needs to be treated more urgently first.
Okay.
I think that it all needs to be dealt with.
It's perfectly okay to have a disagreement here, but I enjoy hearing your viewpoint on this. So we now have several. Let the listeners sort it out, so to speak. Okay, Anders, I leave it to you.
Okay. Well, again, as I was saying, it was interesting hearing from.
Question.
Oh, okay. Inge, go right ahead.
Vlad, you have mentioned Fjordman a couple of times. What would you say to people who still view him as some kind of responsible for the mass murder and terrorism of Breivik?
All right. This is going to take me into some new territory, I think. This is something I haven't really said publicly before, but I think I'm going to. At the time that was actually unfolding live, I was actually live chatting with him over Skype, and not just me and he, and several other people. And we were watching this thing play out and pasting news links at each other, and we were horrified and concerned, but no one more so than Fjordman, who at the time it was perfectly reasonable to think this was an Islamic attack, and everybody thought that. And Fjordman and all of us were, of course, incredibly horrified by what we saw taking place. And as the information and news came out of what it really was, nobody was more horrified than Fjordman as to the true nature of this thing. And then of course the Norwegian police, like any good postmodern source, urgently wanted to find people to make guilty by extension. And they worked very hard to try to make Fjordman into an evil person as the inspiration of this, which of course was ludicrous on every level. Fjordman then himself, and I don't even think he needed to do this. I mean, he shouldn't have needed to do it. I guess he did, but shouldn't have needed to in a real country, in a real civilization that actually uses rule of law. No defense should have been needed. But he went through Breivik's whole, 1,200-page manifesto with a fine tooth comb, as we say in English, carefully examining every point that he made. Nobody was more upset or horrified by this guy's actions than Fjordman was. This guy made up all that stuff in order to spread blame around in every different way that he could. And any attempt to splash Fjordman with the horror of what Breivik did is essentially postmodern nonsense. Fjordman is a hero because he wants to save classical civilization and classical liberal values. By classical liberal values, I mean the European values of the Enlightenment, as beautifully penned by Thomas Jefferson, right? So everything that Fjordman has done has been in that effort about keeping equality of men and women, but not equity, as the postmodernists would have it, of having a society where the rights of the individual were as bright and shiny as humanly possible, as opposed to fictitious collective rights, which we see in both Islam and postmodernism. Fjordman is somebody who really people ought to read. And like I say, and we've discussed already sort of en passant in this podcast, but what the postmodernists try to do is rewrite history to make good people bad so that nobody looks at them. Because people, they have enough work to do without having to know everything, right? So in a way, I don't really blame everybody. But there you go. I think that Fjordman's somebody that really needs to be read. I don't think people should take my word for it. They should go find his essays. I particularly like the one on the Greeks, Islam, and the Scientific Revolution, which talks about the Enlightenment period of Europe and how the Islamic siege on Constantinople drove the great Greek thinkers from Constantinople into Western Europe with all the works of Socrates and Aristotle, and reawoken the spirit of classical thought.
Okay. Third time is the charm.
One more comment.
Okay. Yes? Yes, Inge?
Does anyone remember approximately how many other people were mentioned in Breivik's manifest? I think the Canadian Mark Stein was mentioned there too.
Orwell was quoted plenty of times.
Well, actually, Fjordman wrote essays on specifically that at Gates of Vienna, and I strongly recommend for those interested. I can understand some of you are in Norway and are particularly interested in this, and I think you're right to be. But you should know that really academically high quality essays have been written by Fjordman and with Baron Boddassé at Gates of Vienna, and you'll find them there where he details his analysis of that 1,200-page manifesto, and it's very good. And he names how many people were named, and he says how many people were named how many times. And I really think there's even graphs. It's really worth a look. A lot of time and effort went into that for exactly that question. Well, you know, let's say that Anglosphere media was predictable, right? We live in essentially a communist country. The only reason people don't recognize it is because they have an absolutely fictional idea of what communism is. So because we aren't speaking with Russian accents, and because when you look out the window, everything isn't sepia tone, and because, you know, you don't hear people on the street calling you comrade, people don't really understand that communism isn't about those things. Communism is about equity and restricting freedom of speech so that you can only discuss things which are in conjunction with the narrative. And so, and by the same values, by the way, I consider that people don't recognize that we're a war now because they think war is like a World War II movie, and because things aren't black and white, or, you know, they don't look like a Spielberg production, and because they don't see people in uniforms in trenches, they don't understand that we are in fact at war. It's just that we're losing because we're not fighting back. So yes, the media handled that issue in much the way that you would expect, which is to say that they spread the blame to Fjordman, they spread the blame to racists and haters who were pointing out the problems with Islam.
Yes, Inge?
Yeah, but I was, if you had an example, an episode where a Canadian person or American person got that argument in the face in the media.
You're wondering if there's any examples of guilt by association with events of Utøya? Okay. Do you know any of that, Vlad?
I mean, Gates of Vienna was heavily mentioned. And there was a lot of pressure on Gates of Vienna at the time, and he's an American blogger out of sort of central South America, and so absolutely there was the real. I guess if you're looking for the person who was most affected by this in the United States, it's definitely the blogger who goes by Baron Boddassé at Gates of Vienna, which is why I think he put also so much effort into counter-spinning all the narrative on it. You'll really find the best stuff about this incident on that site, the most factual and the best analysis. I mean, it's really, really very good. They did way more than any commercial journalist did.
Okay. Should we say that's the last word on this issue right now, and then rather invite Vlad at a later time for further discussion?
Sure. Yep.
So thank you all for joining us on TankeKrim, and I hope to see you guys later. Have a good evening.
You too. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.